Stephen, get us up to speed on how traders are adjusting to the mixed messaging out of the Middle East.
You know, I think that of all the situations, worst case scenarios that they were planning for today, when today was supposed to end the ceasefire, this is one of the better scenarios.
34 Iranian tankers did not enter the Strait of Hormuz as a convoy. They entered as pressure, as steel, as timing, as a test of whether the narrowest energy choke point on Earth could be forced open before American sea control closed around it. On the radar screens of U.S. warships east of the Muzandam Peninsula, the formation looked wrong from the start: commercial hulls packed too tightly, course changes too synchronized, escorts too close to the traffic lane, and behind them the shoreline batteries of southern Iran sitting in silent support. If those ships reached the constricted shipping channel in one mass, the strait would stop being a route and become a weapon. The window to prevent that collapse was 7 minutes. At its narrowest practical transit corridor, Hormuz is less a broad sea passage than a funnel lined with suspicion. Tankers inbound and outbound move through separated lanes barely wide enough to feel safe even in peacetime. One damaged hull, one panic turn, one deliberate grounding, and global shipping rates spike before the smoke even clears. On this day, the danger was not only that Iranian tankers might break a blockade pattern. It was that they might break the geometry that keeps the strait alive at all. American commanders watching the plot knew exactly what made this move so dangerous. A warship can be tracked, warned, and if necessary, engaged with clear legal and tactical logic. A commercial tanker is different. It carries flags, crews, cargo, insurance, and political leverage. Multiply that by 34, place them inside one of the most crowded and most surveilled maritime corridors in the world, add Iranian fast attack craft weaving near their flanks, and suddenly the strongest navy on Earth faces the hardest kind of crisis, one where the enemy hides inside consequences. This is why Hormuz has always mattered far beyond the Gulf. A fifth of the world's seaborne oil moves through this water. Asian refineries, European energy traders, American planners, every one of them understands the same brutal truth. You do not need to sink a fleet in Hormuz to shake the world. You only need to convince the market that the strait is no longer predictable. Even a temporary closure can move prices, trigger military alerts, disrupt supply chains, and pull outside powers into a confrontation they never planned to enter. So when 34 Iranian tankers surged toward the channel under the shadow of their own coast, this was not just a shipping incident. It was a geopolitical stress test. The Iranian calculation was cold and clever. Instead of presenting one clear military target, Tehran pushed forward a layered problem. The outer image was civilian: tankers, tugs, logistics hulls, and maritime traffic noise. The inner shell was coercive: Revolutionary Guard speedboats riding close enough to intimidate, drones lifting from coastal sites, and missile crews on islands like Keshem and Larak almost certainly watching the same waters through thermal optics and coastal radar. Any American overreaction could be filmed and sold to the region as proof of a Western chokehold on civilian commerce. Any hesitation could let the convoy punch through and declare the blockade broken by sheer mass. And the threat was bigger than the ships themselves. 34 tankers moving in compressed spacing are a tactical hazard even before weapons enter the picture. Each supertanker carries momentum that cannot be negotiated away. At transit speed, those hulls need see room to correct, deconflict, and recover from engine lag. Pack them into a political maneuver, and they become floating barricades. If even two captains turned across the lane at the same time, either by order or by panic, they could create a navigational jam that would take hours to untangle under ideal conditions and days under fire. If one ship was hit by accident, or claimed to have been hit, the insurance market would treat the entire strait as contaminated risk. That was the real countdown. Not to impact, but to congestion. Not to an explosion, but to a decision point where nobody could maneuver without touching off something larger. U.S. crews had 7 minutes because the lead elements of the Iranian group were closing on the lane merge point where normal traffic, convoy pressure, and naval shadowing would compress into the same patch of water. Past that point, every option became uglier. Boarding was impossible. Warning fire was dangerous. A destroyer could not simply cut across the bows of 34 merchant hulls without inviting collision footage that would race across every satellite channel in the region. The American response began where U.S. naval dominance actually lives now, not in broadside imagery, but in the speed of the sensor network. Aegis combat systems on station destroyers stitched surface tracks with E-2D airborne warning data, P-8 maritime patrol feeds, overhead surveillance, and electronic signatures coming off the Iranian coast. Operators were not just asking where the tankers were. They were mapping who was queuing whom, which fast boats were relaying headings, which coastal radars had shifted from search to fire control behavior, and which drones were climbing high enough to act as spotters. The picture sharpened fast. This was not disorganized commercial panic. It was orchestrated pressure. Then the order went out to launch the fighters. On an American deck south of the strait, 2 F-35s were already armed, fueled, and strapped into a short alert posture built for exactly this kind of compressed crisis. The pilots had no time for a long brief because the brief had effectively been running for hours through datalink updates and threat feeds. 7 minutes was not the countdown to takeoff alone. It was the time available to get airborne, build the battlespace picture, and reach a position where their presence could alter decisions on the water before steel crossed the wrong line. The jets were rolling almost immediately, their lift fans and engine thrust turning deck heat into a shimmering wall behind them. Once airborne, they did not need to race blind toward the strait. Their value was that they arrived already fused into the fight. Every radar return, every emitter, every friendly track, every suspected launcher on the Iranian coast began to resolve inside their cockpit displays as one argument instead of 20 separate reports. In a place where seconds vanish into confusion, that mattered more than raw speed. From the waterline, the response looked almost unreal. The tankers kept pushing, wakes piling into the morning chop, while the American destroyers held offset positions far enough to avoid a collision trap but close enough to dominate the lane with helicopters, guns, and command presence. Overhead, the F-35s came in high first, not for theatrics, but to own the vertical space above the convoy and every drone trying to peek over it. Their job was not to start a battle. Their job was to make sure Iran could not control one. That distinction defined the next few minutes. U.S. commanders did not want a spectacular engagement. They wanted separation, identification, leverage, and a credible threat that would force Tehran's maritime screen to back off. The fighters began by doing what fifth-generation aircraft do best in a naval crisis. They widened the American decision space. One jet focused on the air picture and coastal emitters. The second dropped lower to support surface commanders, confirming visual geometry on the lead tanker group, escort craft spacing, and any attempt to mask armed boats inside commercial traffic. Data flowed from cockpit to ship and back again in near real time. The weapons logic was brutal because it had to be. If Iran escalated from coercion to attack, the first targets were obvious: missile launchers that lit up in a firing profile, armed fast boats racing inside weapon release distance, drones feeding target data, and any escort vessel attempting to ram or board. But until that threshold was crossed, discipline mattered more than firepower. The destroyers held their vertical launch cells in reserve. Their close-in guns tracked. Their helicopters prepared for warning passes and surface identification. Electronic warfare teams worked to degrade hostile cueing without giving Iran the clean propaganda image of a missile streaking across the strait. Meanwhile, the Iranian side kept probing for hesitation. Several fast craft surged ahead of the convoy's starboard flank, then checked speed, then surged again, trying to force an American ship to maneuver in a way that would open the lane. A drone appeared over the northern shoulder of the formation, low and steady, likely feeding video back to shore. On the coast, one radar blinked from search mode into a tighter pattern and stayed there just long enough to raise every pulse rate in the American chain of command. The danger in Hormuz is rarely a single dramatic move. It is the accumulation of smaller moves that corner everyone else into a bad answer. The F-35s answered with presence and precision. One jet dropped its nose and cut across the convoy's forward axis at enough speed to be seen by every bridge crew without crossing into reckless intimidation. The second shifted east, hunting the drone's control architecture and forcing the aircraft out of its comfortable orbit. At the same time, U.S. ships transmitted direct navigational warnings to the lead tankers, ordering immediate deconfliction and respacing under international transit safety protocols. It was law backed by combat power, not shouted panic. For a few seconds, nothing changed. That was the most dangerous moment of all. 34 heavy hulls still advancing. Iranian escorts still posturing. Coastal batteries still watching. American commanders now fully committed, but still one irreversible step short of violence. Then the first fracture appeared. The lead tanker on the southern edge of the Iranian formation cut speed by several knots. That single reduction mattered because every ship behind it had been operating inside a choreography that depended on momentum. The second lead hull drifted slightly out of alignment to avoid closing too hard. A third corrected late, producing a widening gap on the convoy's eastern shoulder. The formation was no longer a wall. It was becoming traffic again. And once that happened, the coercive shield around it began to weaken. Iranian fast boats tried to restore the shape, darting in and out, signaling aggressively, throwing wakes across the bows of their own tankers. That only made the Americans more certain of the intent. One U.S. helicopter dropped lower, close enough for its rotor wash to remind the speedboats that they were now being individually tracked, filmed, and if ordered, targetable within seconds. Above them, the F-35s remained the lid on the crisis. Any drone climbing for a clearer view was detected. Any coastal emitter flirting with a lock was immediately registered, correlated, and silently placed on the list of things that could disappear first if Tehran pushed too far. The engagement finally turned at the edge of the lane merge point. An Iranian escort craft accelerated hard toward a U.S. destroyer's projected path, either as a feint or as the beginning of a harassment run. It never got to finish the thought. An American warning sequence hit all at once: bridge-to-bridge challenge, helicopter reposition, destroyer maneuver queue, fighter overhead, and unmistakable fire control posture without a shot being fired. The escort boat broke away. That breakaway was the signal everyone else had been waiting for. Commercial masters inside the convoy began choosing seamanship over spectacle. One by one, tanker bridges answered the reality in front of them. They widened intervals. They aligned with the traffic scheme. They stopped behaving like parts of a political demonstration and started acting like captains responsible for giant, vulnerable ships in a dangerous strait. Some were surely following orders from shore. Some were almost certainly deciding that no flag was worth burning to death inside a steel box full of crude. The American plan had always depended on that human factor. Separate the professionals at sea from the politics on land, and the convoy loses its edge. That did not mean the risk vanished. For nearly 20 minutes after the first slowdown, every radar operator in the area was waiting for the hidden second act: a missile launch from shore, a suicide drone from a fishing dhow, a deliberate collision blamed on confusion, an engine room fire transformed into a casus belli. None came. Iran had pushed hard, but not hard enough to cross the line where the United States could respond with open destruction and regional sympathy would evaporate with the smoke. By the time the 34th tanker cleared the most dangerous segment of the approach, the breakthrough had failed in the only way that mattered. The convoy had not shattered American control of the strait. It had been absorbed, slowed, sorted, and stripped of its political theater under the gaze of U.S. ships and U.S. aircraft. Tehran could still claim that Iranian tankers transited Hormuz. It could not honestly claim that it had overpowered U.S. naval dominance. The sea told a different story. The convoy moved because Washington allowed navigation to continue under rules it still had the power to enforce. Every captain in that lane understood the signal. Washington was not closing Hormuz for regional prestige. It was preventing Tehran from turning civilian tonnage into strategic blackmail under cover of routine transit. That aftermath is where most people misunderstand maritime crises. Victory at sea is not always a burning wreck or a triumphant boarding team on the evening news. Sometimes it is the prevention of the one image your opponent needed. Iran needed video of tankers smashing through a blockade while American forces flinched or fired wildly. Instead, the world saw disciplined control. No panic. No overreaction. No dramatic breach. Just U.S. commanders using surveillance, positioning, legal authority, and carefully staged force to turn a mass challenge back into ordinary shipping. The message reached far beyond the Gulf. For Gulf monarchies, it was proof that the strait could still be held open without setting the whole region on fire. For energy markets, it was a warning that volatility was real but not yet sovereign. For every navy watching from outside, it was a sharp reminder that 21st century sea power is not just about who has the bigger fleet. It is about who can process chaos fastest, identify the true threat inside civilian clutter, and impose order before hesitation becomes disaster. The F-35s were central to that lesson. Not because they dropped bombs or scored dramatic kills, but because they compressed time in America's favor. 7 minutes in Hormuz is nothing. It is a breath between a tense transit and a regional crisis. Those jets turned 7 minutes into enough awareness, enough pressure, and enough deterrence to keep 34 tankers from becoming the front edge of something far worse. In modern naval warfare, that is dominance, the power to decide what kind of fight happens, or whether it happens at all. And that is why the strait remained open that day. Not because the danger was small, and not because Iran lacked nerve, but because nerve met a force that understood the terrain, the law, the sensors, and the human psychology of the sea better than the challenge coming at it. Hormuz did not erupt. It tightened, trembled, and then yielded to the side that could hold its fire while still holding control. In the end, 34 Iranian tankers entered the world's most dangerous corridor as a test of American resolve. They left as proof that in a place where one bad decision can choke the planet's energy artery, dominance belongs to the side that can win the crisis before the shooting starts.